They say a home is where the heart is, but for Theodora Voss, home became a locked door the moment her son stopped breathing. She had given that family everything: her savings, her years, her silence. And when she had nothing left to give, they handed her a suitcase and pointed at the street. At 72, with an arthritic knee, a small dog named Gumbo, and a box of old photographs, Teddy walked out into a gray Tuesday morning with nowhere to go. But what Portia never counted on, what she couldn't have known when she changed the locks and moved on with her life, was that Ignatius Voss had loved his wife the way men rarely do: quietly, practically, and with a plan that would outlast it by 15 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Theodora Voss had never been the kind of woman who asked for much. She'd grown up in a working-class family in western Pennsylvania, the second of 4 children, raised on the principle that you worked hard, kept your complaints to yourself, and showed love through action rather than words. She carried that philosophy into her marriage, into her motherhood, and eventually into the quiet grief of her later years, long after the people she'd built her life around were gone. She met Ignatius Voss at a county fair when she was 23. He was working a summer job repairing farm equipment, broad-shouldered and sunburned, with grease under his fingernails and a laugh that seemed too big for the open field they were standing in. She liked him immediately, not because he was charming. He wasn't, particularly, but because when he talked to her, he looked at her like she was the only person at the fair. They married 14 months later in a small church outside Cellar, a mid-sized city in the Ohio Valley, with 40 guests and a reception in her parents' backyard. The marriage was a good one. Not perfect. Ignatius had a stubborn streak that could make simple disagreements last 3 days longer than necessary. Teddy had a habit of internalizing worry until it came out sideways. But they were honest with each other, and they worked. Ignatius spent 31 years as a heavy equipment mechanic, first for a construction company, then independently. Teddy worked part-time at a dental office for 20 years, then stopped when her mother got sick and needed care. By the time their son Leander was grown and out of the house, they had a modest savings, a paid-off house on Crescent Hill Road, and a life that felt, by most measures, complete. Leander was their only child. He'd been a quiet boy, thoughtful, a little serious, the kind of kid who read books about history for fun and built model planes with painstaking patience. Teddy had adored him. Ignatius had been proud of him in that reserved way fathers of that generation often were, not saying it outright, but showing it in small, consistent ways. Paying for Leander's college without complaint, driving 4 hours each way to watch him walk across the graduation stage, fixing his first car twice without charging him a cent. When Leander was 34, he married Portia Hensley. She was sharp, well-dressed, and confident in a way that filled rooms. Teddy made a genuine effort to love her. She hosted dinners, remembered Portia's birthday, bit her tongue during disagreements about things that didn't truly matter. For a while, it seemed to work. Portia wasn't warm, exactly, but she was civil, and civil felt like enough. Then Ignatius died. A stroke, sudden and complete, on a Wednesday afternoon in March. He was 68 years old. Teddy was 66, and the grief hit her like something physical, like a wall she kept walking into for months afterward. She functioned, she cooked, she answered the phone, she attended to the paperwork that death requires. But she moved through those tasks like a woman underwater. Leander came when he could, but he had a demanding job in corporate logistics and lived 40 minutes away. Portia came less. 3 years after Ignatius died, Leander called his mother with a proposal. He and Portia had found a house they wanted to buy, but the down payment was beyond their reach. Would Teddy consider selling her place on Crescent Hill Road and moving in with them? There was a spare room, plenty of space. She wouldn't be a burden. It would be good for everyone. Teddy thought about it for 2 weeks. The house on Crescent Hill Road held 31 years of her life with Ignatius. Leaving it felt like a second loss. But Leander was her son, and she missed seeing him regularly. And the house was too large for one person, and she was 69 years old and practical enough to admit that. She sold the house. She handed Leander and Portia the proceeds, just over $90,000, and moved into the spare bedroom on the second floor of their colonial-style home in a Kellerton suburb called Birchwood Crossing. She told herself it was temporary. She'd find a small apartment eventually, once they were settled. That was 4 years ago. The years in Birchwood Crossing were not easy ones, though Teddy would not have said so out loud. She made herself useful, cooking most evenings, keeping the house clean, watching Gumbo, the squat little beagle mix Leander had adopted 2 years into their marriage. Gumbo had taken to Teddy immediately, sleeping at her feet, following her from room to room, sitting beside her chair every evening with the focused loyalty only dogs manage. He was, in those years, her steadiest companion. Leander smoothed things over when the tension got sharp. He had his father's instinct for de-escalation. When Portia made comments about the kitchen being reorganized, or about Teddy's presence making it hard to have people over, Leander would quietly redirect and apologize to both sides. He was a good man stretched thin between two women who wanted different things. Then, 18 months ago, Leander went to his company's annual conference in Cincinnati. On the second day, during a morning session, he collapsed. A brain hemorrhage. He was airlifted to a hospital, but never regained consciousness. He was 41 years old. Teddy lost her son the same way she'd lost her husband. Without warning, without time to prepare, without a single chance to say the things she should have said years earlier. She was 71 years old, and she had now outlived every person who had ever been the center of her world. The grief this time was different, quieter, heavier, like something had been removed from inside her chest and not replaced. What came after was worse. Portia grieved. Teddy believed that, at least in the beginning, she'd seen the way her daughter-in-law moved through the house in those first weeks after Leander's death. Mechanical, distracted, sometimes sitting at the kitchen table for long stretches without doing anything at all. They didn't comfort each other. They weren't built that way, the two of them. But they coexisted in the shared wreckage of losing the same man. And for a while, that felt like enough. The first year was survivable. Portia worked long hours at her consulting firm, leaving early and coming home late. Teddy kept the house, walked Gumbo twice a day through the quiet streets of Birchwood Crossing, and cooked dinners that Portia often reheated alone after Teddy had already gone to bed. They spoke when they needed to. They stayed out of each other's way when they didn't. It wasn't warmth, but it was a functioning arrangement, and Teddy was too hollowed out by grief to want anything more complicated. The second year was different. Portia started going out on weekends. She bought new clothes, changed her hair, came home from evenings out with a brightness in her face that hadn't been there in months. Teddy said nothing. Portia was 39 years old. She had the right to rebuild her life. Teddy understood that, genuinely. What she hadn't anticipated was how quickly that rebuilding would require her own removal. She first heard Drummond's name on a Thursday evening in late October. Portia mentioned him casually over coffee. Someone from a professional networking event, very successful. They'd been spending time together. Teddy nodded and said that was nice to hear. 3 weeks later, Drummond was at the dinner table. He was 42, lean and deliberate in the way of men who are accustomed to being listened to. He shook Teddy's hand with the practiced politeness of someone checking a box, then spent the rest of the evening talking to Portia as though Teddy were a piece of furniture that happened to be seated across from him. By January, he was staying over regularly. By March, he was leaving his things in the bathroom and taking Portia's car to the gym at 6 in the morning. The house that Teddy's money had helped purchase felt, with each passing week, less like somewhere she lived and more like somewhere she was being quietly tolerated until a better arrangement could be made. The conversation she had been dreading came on a Sunday in April. Portia asked her to sit down at the kitchen table, the same table Teddy had bought secondhand, and refinish herself the first year she'd moved in. Drummond was there too, leaning against the counter with his coffee, which Teddy thought was a choice. Portia kept her voice measured. She and Drummond were making plans, she said. Long-term plans. They wanted to formalize things, restructure the household, move forward together. She appreciated everything Teddy had done over the years. She genuinely did. But the time had come for both of them to have their own space. Teddy asked how much time she had. Portia said 2 weeks. The number landed like something dropped from a height. 2 weeks. Teddy was 72 years old with a bad knee, a fixed Social Security income, and no property to her name. She had approximately $400 in her checking account and no savings. Everything had gone to Leander and Portia years ago, and what little remained had been quietly absorbed into household expenses over time. 2 weeks was not a transition. It was an eviction with a polite word wrapped around it. She said as much, calmly, without raising her voice, because she had spent too many years learning how to keep her voice level when she wanted to scream. Portia's expression didn't shift. She said that Teddy was resourceful, that there were senior housing programs and assistance organizations, that Leander would have wanted Teddy to be independent. That last part was the one that cut the deepest. Using her dead son's name as a prop in an argument, he would have found unconscionable. Drummond said nothing throughout. He refilled his coffee and looked out the window, which somehow made it worse. Teddy spent the following days making calls that went nowhere. Senior housing waitlists ran 6 to 9 months. Assisted living was beyond any budget she could construct. The one friend she might have stayed with, a woman named Clementine she'd known for 20 years, had moved to Arizona to be near her grandchildren. There was no one. On the 14th day, Teddy packed 2 bags and a canvas tote containing Leander's baby photos, her wedding album, and a framed picture of Ignatius from the summer they'd spent a week in the Smoky Mountains. The happiest week she could remember. She came downstairs at 8 in the morning. Portia was already dressed for work. They looked at each other across the foyer. Teddy picked up Gumbo, tucked him under her arm, and walked out the front door. She heard it close behind her. She didn't look back. The morning was cold for April. A thin layer of frost still clung to the grass along the sidewalk, and the sky had that flat, colorless quality that made everything look temporary. Teddy stood on the curb outside the house in Birchwood Crossing with 2 bags at her feet, Gumbo tucked against her chest, and no plan beyond the next hour. She started walking. There was no destination in mind, not at first. She walked because standing still felt worse, because movement gave the illusion of purpose, and because Gumbo needed to be set down eventually and allowed to do his business, which he did unbothered on a neighbor's lawn while Teddy stood holding his leash and staring at nothing in particular. She sat on a bench outside a pharmacy for a long time. She watched people come and go with their prescriptions and their reusable bags and their ordinary Tuesday morning problems, and she felt entirely removed from all of it, as though she were watching through glass. She was 72 years old, and she had nowhere to sleep that night. The strangeness of that fact kept arriving in fresh waves every few minutes, each one slightly harder to absorb than the last. She called the senior services number she'd been given during her 2 weeks of fruitless phone calls. The woman on the other end was kind but honest. Emergency shelter placement for seniors in Kellerton took anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks, and the facilities were basic. There were no guarantees. Teddy wrote down the address, thanked the woman, and sat with the phone in her lap. Then she thought about Ignatius. Not for the first time that morning. She'd been thinking about him in the fragmented, involuntary way grief works. A flash of his hands, the sound of his voice saying her name, the way he always double-checked the locks before bed. But this time her thoughts settled on something specific, something practical, which was very much in his character. Before Ignatius died, during a period when he'd been quietly putting his affairs in order without telling Teddy how serious things had become, he had mentioned the property. Offhandedly, almost. They'd been eating breakfast, and he'd said something about the land his Uncle Harmon had left him, a parcel out past the town of Sycamore Bend, about 42 miles east of Kellerton. He'd said he'd been paying the taxes on it for years, that there was an old farmhouse foundation and a root cellar out there, maybe an acre of clear ground and 3 more scrubwoods. He'd said they should drive out sometime and take a look. They never had. After he died, Teddy had found the property deed in his files, tucked inside a manila folder labeled Simply Land. She'd kept it without thinking much about it. The tax payments were small, automatic, easy to forget. She hadn't forgotten the land exactly, but she hadn't thought of it as anything real or usable. It was just a piece of paper in a folder in a box that had moved with her from Crescent Hill Road to Birchwood Crossing and sat in the back of the closet ever since. She went back to the house. Portia's car was gone. Drummond's too. Teddy used her key, which still worked, and went to the closet in her former bedroom. The box was where she'd left it. She found the folder, took the deed, and left. She didn't take anything else. She left her key on the kitchen counter. At the bus station, she bought a ticket to Sycamore Bend for $19. The man at the counter looked at her bags and her dog and said nothing, which she appreciated. The ride took just under 2 hours. Gumbo slept in her lap the entire way, which helped more than she could have articulated. Sycamore Bend was smaller than she'd expected. A grain elevator, a hardware store, a diner with a hand-painted sign, a post office the size of a garage. She stopped at the diner and asked a woman behind the counter if she knew the old Voss parcel east of town. The woman, who introduced herself as Clella, thought about it for a moment and then nodded. Said it was out past the Henning Road turnoff, maybe 3 miles on a dirt track. Said nobody had been out there in years as far as she knew. Teddy bought a bottle of water, a package of crackers, and a small tin of dog food. She had $63 left. Then she started walking. The dirt road was rough and badly rutted, edged on both sides by scrub brush and young trees that had grown in over what might once have been cleared pasture. Teddy's knee ached badly by the first mile. She stopped twice to rest, setting her bags down and letting Gumbo sniff along the roadside while she caught her breath. The sky had gone from flat gray to a pale, watery blue by the time she saw the property. It was not encouraging. The farmhouse itself had been gone for decades, reduced to a partial stone foundation half buried in weeds. A rusted metal roof panel lay in the grass nearby, detached from whatever structure it had once covered. The cleared acre Ignatius had mentioned was barely recognizable as such, crowded with sumac and thistle and the skeletal remains of old fence posts. A large oak tree had fallen across one corner and simply been left where it landed. And there, set into the slope at the back of the property, was the root cellar. It was built into the hillside the old way, stone-faced, with a heavy wooden door reinforced by rusted iron straps. Weeds had grown thick around the frame. The door itself was swollen with moisture and years of disuse, but it was still standing, still closed, still intact. Gumbo had been trotting alongside Teddy on his leash since they'd left the dirt road. The moment they got within 30 feet of the root cellar, he stopped. His nose went up. Then he pulled hard toward the door and started to scratch. Teddy pulled Gumbo back from the door and told him to settle. He didn't. He circled back the moment she loosened her grip on the leash, scratching at the base of the wooden door with both front paws, his nails making a dry, frantic sound against the old wood. She'd had Gumbo for 6 years, and she knew his repertoire well. The bark he used for squirrels was different from the one for strangers, and the whine he made when he wanted dinner was nothing like the focused, insistent energy he was directing at that door right now. This was something else. This was the behavior of a dog who had found something and intended to be taken seriously about it. She tied his leash to a nearby fence post and turned her attention to the door. The iron latch was seized with rust, but hadn't locked. It took her several minutes of working it back and forth, her arthritic fingers protesting the whole time, before it finally gave. The door itself was the bigger problem. Years of moisture had swollen the wood into the frame, and Teddy had to brace her good foot against the stone facing and pull with both hands before it lurched open with a groan that scattered a pair of starlings from the oak tree nearby. The smell that came out was cold and mineral and old, damp stone and earth, and the faint ghost of whatever had once been stored down there. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The root cellar was deeper than she'd expected. Rough stone steps led down about 8 feet to a floor of packed dirt. The walls were dry-stacked fieldstone, the ceiling low enough that she'd have to duck slightly. Wooden shelving lined both walls, most of it collapsed or badly warped, the remains of old mason jars scattered across the floor, their lids rusted, their contents long since turned to nothing. A broken wooden crate sat in one corner. Cobwebs covered everything. Gumbo was still pulling at his leash behind her, whimpering with an urgency that hadn't diminished. She went down the steps carefully, one hand on the stone wall, testing each step before committing her weight. The light from the open door reached the bottom, but didn't do much beyond that. She wished she'd thought to buy a flashlight in town. She used her phone instead, switching on the torch and sweeping it slowly across the space. Nothing on the left wall. Collapsed shelving, broken glass, dirt. She turned to the right. The shelving on that side had held up better, the boards still level, supported by stone brackets set into the wall. And on the lowest shelf, pushed back against the wall and half hidden behind the remains of a rotted wooden box, was a canvas bag. Military style, olive drab, with a drawstring closure and a leather patch on the side that had dried and cracked, but not disintegrated. Teddy stood very still for a moment. Then she crossed the cellar and picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it up the steps and out into the pale afternoon light, setting it down on a flat section of the stone foundation. Gumbo immediately strained toward it, tail going hard, nose working furiously. She unhooked his leash so he could come closer, and he circled the bag twice before sitting down next to it and looking up at her with an expression that seemed to say, "Finally." The drawstring was stiff but workable. She loosened it and looked inside. There were 3 things in the bag. A metal document tube with a screw cap, the kind used for storing papers in damp conditions. A smaller canvas pouch tied with a cord. And a sealed plastic container, the heavy-duty kind, with a rubber gasket around the lid. She opened the document tube first. Inside, rolled and protected by a layer of wax paper, were several sheets of paper. A handwritten letter on top, the handwriting unmistakably Ignatius's, the same careful, slightly cramped print she'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists for 34 years. She sat down on the stone foundation and read. He'd written it 8 months before he died, during a period when he'd known his health was declining and had told her only that he was tired and needed to slow down. He apologized for that in the first paragraph, for not telling her how serious it was, for deciding, in his stubborn practical way, that preparing for the worst was more useful than discussing it. He told her he'd been coming out to the property on weekends for the better part of 2 years, that he'd always meant for it to be their retirement place, a simple cabin, some garden space, somewhere quiet and away from everything. He'd never told her because he wanted to have something real to show her before he said anything about it. He never got that far. What he had done over those 2 years of quiet weekend trips was work. He'd reinforced the root cellar. He'd cleared some of the land, and he'd stored things there, things he didn't trust the banks and didn't want mixed up in the paperwork of an estate. The smaller canvas pouch contained gold. Not coins exactly, but small gold bars, the kind sold by private dealers, each one about the size of domino. There were 11 of them. A folded receipt from a precious metals dealer in Pittsburgh, dated 4 years before his death, listed the purchase price. The current market value, Teddy would later learn, was considerably higher. The plastic container held documents, property records, a second deed she hadn't known existed covering 2 additional acres adjacent to the parcel, and a handwritten inventory of everything in the bag. At the bottom of the letter, Ignatius had written one more line. "You always took care of everyone else, Teddy. This is me taking care of you. I'm sorry I couldn't do it in person. I loved you every single day." She sat on that cold stone foundation for a long time. Gumbo climbed in her lap, which he was too large to do comfortably, and she let him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Teddy spent her first night on the property in the root cellar. It wasn't a decision so much as a practical reality. She had no money for a motel, no car to sleep in, and the April night was cold enough that staying outside wasn't an option. She swept the cellar floor with a broken shelf board, spread her jacket over the cleanest section of ground, and lay down with Gumbo pressed against her side and the canvas bag tucked under her head like a pillow. The stone walls held the cold the way stone does, deep and even and unrelenting. She slept in patches, waking every hour or so, staring up at the dark ceiling and listening to Gumbo breathe. By the second morning, she had a plan. She walked into Sycamore Bend and found Clella at the diner again, who pointed her toward the only motel within 15 miles, a 12-room place called the Pine View on the highway outside town. Teddy paid for 3 nights with the last of her cash and a modest reserve on a credit card she'd kept for emergencies and rarely used. It was enough time to do what needed doing. The gold bars went first. She took the bus back to Kellerton carrying the canvas pouch inside her jacket, went directly to a precious metals dealer on the commercial end of Farlow Street, and sat across from a careful, unhurried man named Mr. Haruki Shimada, who examined each bar with the focused attention of someone who took his work seriously. He told her the 11 bars had a current market value of just over $220,000. He said it twice, watching her face. Teddy's face gave very little away. She'd had a long life of practice. She sold 4 of the bars that afternoon for $86,000, which Mr. Shimada arranged as a cashier's check drawn on a bank 2 blocks away. He kept the remaining 7 in a secure holding arrangement while she opened an account, something she did the same afternoon, sitting in a bank branch with her new check and her 2-day-old address at the Pineview Motel and a composure she did not entirely feel. She returned to Sycamore Bend the following morning with a phone she'd bought at a drugstore and a list she'd made in the motel room the night before. She extended her stay at the Pineview by another 2 weeks, then started making calls. The first contractor she spoke to drove out to the property on a Thursday and walked the land with her for an hour. He was a local man named Darnell who'd done restorations before and didn't seem fazed by what he was looking at. He told her the root cellar was structurally sound, better built than most things that age. The foundation stones from the old farmhouse were good material, reusable. The cleared acre was workable. He gave her a number for a basic but solid build, and she told him to start the following Monday. What went up over the next 4 months was not large, but it was good. A single-room cabin built into and around the existing root cellar, using the original stone foundation as its base, the cellar itself becoming a lower level for storage and cool keeping. The cabin sat on the slope with a south-facing window that caught the afternoon light. A small covered porch ran along the front. A composting system, a rainwater collection setup paired with a drilled well, solar panels on the roof angled for maximum winter gain. A wood stove in the center of the main room that could heat the entire space in under an hour. Darnell's crew built it straight and without shortcuts. Teddy was there every day, watching, asking questions, making small decisions about things like window placement and shelf depth that added up over 4 months into a space that felt genuinely hers. She bought a used truck from a man in town for $3,200, which gave her mobility and ended her dependence on the bus schedule. She bought tools, seeds, practical clothing, a good pair of boots, a proper bed. She spent money carefully and without guilt, which was a new experience. Every purchase felt like a small act of reconstruction. The garden went in during the 2nd month. She'd always grown things, tomatoes and herbs in pots on the Crescent Hill Road windowsill, a small bed of vegetables at Birchwood Crossing that Portia had found aesthetically objectionable. Here she had actual ground. She planted late for the season, but still managed a row of green beans, 2 kinds of lettuce, a sprawling zucchini plant that Gumbo regarded with deep suspicion, and a section of herbs along the south-facing wall that caught enough sun to do well. She also fixed the root cellar door properly, rehung it, replaced the rusted iron straps, fitted it with a new latch. She kept it stocked with preserved food and the remaining gold bars, which she was in no hurry to sell. The cellar that had held Ignatius's hidden provision for her now held her own provisions in turn. That continuity pleased her in a way she didn't try to put into words. Through the summer, as the cabin took shape and the garden grew and the property began to look like somewhere a person had chosen to live rather than been stranded, Teddy felt something returning that she hadn't noticed leaving. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but steadiness. The particular kind of steadiness that comes from knowing you can manage, that the ground under you is solid, that you put it there yourself. Gumbo had taken a country life with an enthusiasm that bordered on the embarrassing. He hunted field mice with grim determination and zero success. He developed a complicated relationship with a groundhog that lived under the woodpile. He slept on the porch in the evenings and watched the tree line with the serious expression of a dog who considered himself the primary security apparatus of the operation. Teddy watched him one evening from the porch steps, the late summer light going gold across the cleared acre, the cabin behind her solid and warm, and thought that Ignatius would have loved this place. She was going to be all right. It started with Clella. The woman from the diner had been quietly curious about Teddy since the first morning she'd walked in off the highway with 2 bags and a beagle mix, and asked for directions to a piece of land nobody had visited in years. Over the months of construction, Clella had watched Teddy come in regularly for coffee and occasionally for a hot meal, always alone, always with a list or a notebook, always paying and tipping despite circumstances that clearly didn't require generosity. One morning in late August, Clella sat down across from her uninvited and asked directly what her story was. Teddy told her, not all of it, not the financial details, but the shape of it. The son she'd lost, the home she'd given up, the daughter-in-law who'd handed her a deadline and opened the front door, the land she'd remembered at the last possible moment. Clella listened without interrupting, which Teddy appreciated more than she could say. When Teddy finished, Clella was quiet for a moment, then said she knew 3 women in the county who needed to hear that story, and would Teddy mind if she passed along her number. Teddy said she didn't mind. The first woman who called was named Lavinia. She was 68, recently widowed, and her 2 adult sons had been pressuring her for months to sell her house and move into a facility they'd selected without consulting her. She wasn't sick. She wasn't incapacitated. She was grieving and temporarily disoriented, and they had mistaken that for permanent incompetence. She'd been awake at 3 in the morning for 6 weeks running, trying to figure out if they were right about her. Teddy invited her out to the property on a Saturday. Lavinia arrived in a sensible sedan, looked at the cabin and the garden and the root cellar door, and Gumbo, conducting his patrol of the perimeter, and burst into tears within 5 minutes. Not sad tears, she clarified quickly. The other kind. The kind that come when you see evidence that something you'd stopped believing in is actually possible. They talked for 4 hours. Teddy made coffee, and they sat on the porch, and Lavinia talked about her sons, and Teddy talked about Leander and Portia, and the morning she'd walked out of Birchwood Crossing with 2 bags and a dog, and no destination. Lavinia left in the late afternoon looking like a different person than the one who'd arrived. She called the following week and asked if she could bring someone. The someone was Solange, 64, whose husband of 38 years had left her 8 months earlier for a woman he'd met at a work conference. He'd emptied their joint savings account 11 days before telling her, a sequencing that his lawyer later described as legally defensible. Solange had spent the better part of the year feeling like she'd been erased, like the life she'd lived hadn't counted for anything because the person she'd lived it with had decided to walk away from it. Then came Eudora, 70, whose daughter-in-law had done something remarkably similar to what Portia had done to Teddy, so similar in its details that Teddy had to stop Eudora twice during the telling just to sit with the weight of how common it apparently was. Eudora had been sleeping on a friend's pull-out sofa for 3 months and had started to believe, in a specific way prolonged uncertainty erodes a person, that this was simply what the rest of her life would look like. By October, Teddy was hosting gatherings on Saturday afternoons. They started with 4 women around the fire pit Darnell had helped her build in the cleared area behind the cabin. Then 6, then 9. They brought food to share, and sometimes wine, and always their stories, which were different in their specifics and remarkably consistent in their emotional architecture. Loss, displacement, the gradual erosion of self-worth that happened when the people around you treated you as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be considered. Teddy didn't position herself as a leader or a counselor. She was clear about that from the beginning. She had no credentials, no methodology, no program. What she had was a story and a piece of land and the particular authority that comes from having actually survived the thing you're talking about. She spoke plainly, listened carefully, and made very good coffee. That turned out to be sufficient. She also gave practical advice when it was asked for. How to access senior legal aid services. How to read a property deed. How to calculate whether a financial decision someone was pressuring you to make actually serve your interests or theirs. Ignatius had taught her to be practical about money in the same way he'd been practical about engines. Not complicated, just honest about how the parts actually worked. Word spread in the way things spread in small communities, through churches and hair salons, and the particular telephone network of women who knew women who knew women. A regional blog that covered sustainable living in rural communities ran a short piece about the property in November, focusing on the cabin conversion and the garden. The writer mentioned, almost as an aside, that the owner hosted informal gatherings for women navigating late-life transitions. The piece ran on a Wednesday. By Friday, Teddy had 11 messages from women she'd never met. She hired Fern in December. Fern was 59, recently laid off from a hospital administrative job, needing income and purpose in roughly equal measure. She handled the practical coordination of the gatherings, brought order to the communication that Teddy found overwhelming, and turned out to make a considerably better pie than Teddy did, which became its own form of community service. The property had a name by then, though nobody had formally given it one. People in town just called it Teddy's place. That felt right. It was hers entirely and without condition, and it showed. Portia found out about Teddy's place the same way most people did. She read about it online. It was a Saturday morning in February, 10 months after she'd watched Teddy walk out the front door of the Birchwood Crossing house with 2 bags and a Beagle mix and no forwarding address. Portia was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop and her coffee, doing what she'd been doing most mornings lately, searching for solutions to problems that didn't have clean solutions. The house payment was 3 weeks behind. Drummond's latest business venture, a logistics consulting firm he'd launched with considerable confidence and insufficient capital, had stopped generating income in November. Their joint account had a balance that made her stomach tighten every time she checked it. She hadn't been looking for Teddy specifically. She'd been reading an article about rural property values when a sidebar link caught her eye. A regional blog piece about sustainable living and late-life reinvention. The thumbnail image showed a stone and timber cabin set into a hillside, a south-facing porch, a winter garden still producing along a sheltered wall. A small dog visible on the porch steps. She recognized the dog before she recognized the woman standing beside him. Portia read the article twice. Then she read 2 more pieces the blog had linked to, a local news segment transcript, and a short feature from a regional magazine. Each one told roughly the same story without telling all of it. A woman in her 70s who had arrived at a neglected piece of inherited land with almost nothing and built something genuine from it. A gathering place for women dealing with displacement and loss. A root cellar that had, in the careful phrasing the writers used, contained resources left by her late husband that made the transformation possible. Portia closed the laptop and sat with that for a long time. Then she opened it again and showed Drummond. His reaction moved through several stages in the space of about 2 minutes. Surprise, then calculation, then the particular focused energy he got when he thought he'd identified an opportunity. He said that Teddy had clearly been sitting on assets she'd never disclosed. He said that Portia, as Leander's widow, might have legal standing worth exploring. He said they should drive out there and talk to her directly, that showing up in person was harder to ignore than a phone call. Portia knew it was a bad idea. She went anyway, because the alternative was sitting in a house that was sliding toward foreclosure while Drummond made calls to lawyers who charged by the quarter hour. They drove out on a Sunday in late February. The property was easy enough to find once they got to Sycamore Bend. 2 people at the gas station knew exactly where Teddy's place was and gave directions without being asked for context. That small fact settled into Portia's chest in a way she didn't examine too closely. What she saw when they turned onto the property road was not what she'd expected, even after the articles. The photographs hadn't captured the scale of it. The way the cabin sat so naturally into the hillside, it looked like it had always been there, the winter garden along the south wall, the cleared land with its fire pit and circle of mismatched chairs, the general impression of a place that had been thought about and cared for by someone who intended to stay. 4 women were visible on the porch as they parked. The conversation stopped when Portia and Drummond got out of the car. Teddy appeared in the cabin doorway a moment later. She looked at them with an expression that contained no surprise whatsoever, which told Portia she'd been at least partially expected. Teddy came down the porch steps and walked toward them with the unhurried movement of a woman on her own ground. She looked well, better than well. She looked like herself, which was not how Portia remembered her from the years at Birchwood Crossing. The anxious, careful woman who'd moved through the house, trying to take up as little space as possible, had been replaced by someone who stood in the cold February air like she owned it, which she did. "Portia," Teddy said. Her voice was even. Portia had prepared something to say on the drive over. It dissolved. I saw the articles, she said instead. Teddy nodded. I thought you might eventually. Drummond stepped forward and introduced himself with the confidence of a man who believed confidence was its own form of leverage. He said they'd been hoping to have a conversation about Teddy's situation, about the property and its history, about what Leander might have wanted for his family. Teddy looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she turned to the women on the porch and asked if they'd give her a few minutes. They went inside without comment, though one of them, Eudora, closed the door with a deliberateness that was not quite a slam. Teddy turned back to Portia and Drummond and gestured toward the chairs around the fire pit. Sit down, she said. I'll say this once, and I'll say it plainly, so there's no confusion about what I mean. They sat. Drummond tried to take control of the conversation immediately, which Teddy had anticipated. He laid out a version of events in which Portia had generously housed Teddy for years, in which the assets hidden on the property represented a kind of concealment that affected the family's financial picture, in which Leander's memory created obligations that ran in multiple directions. He used words like equitable and consideration and reasonable arrangement. He spoke with the fluency of a man who had talked his way into and out of things many times before. Teddy let him finish. Then she said, quietly and without heat, that she had given Leander and Portia $90,000 from the sale of her home, that she had cooked and cleaned and maintained the Birchwood Crossing house for 4 years without compensation, that she had been given 14 days' notice to vacate at 72 years old with no savings and nowhere to go, and that Portia had watched her walk out the door knowing all of that and had gone to work anyway. She said that the property and everything on it had belonged to Ignatius, who had left it to her, and that she had no legal or moral obligation to explain her finances to either of them. She said that Leander's name was not a tool, and she'd prefer they stopped using it as one. Drummond opened his mouth. Teddy looked at him, and he closed it again. Portia had been staring at the dead fire pit through all of this. When she finally spoke, her voice was different from Drummond's. Smaller. The professional composure she'd worn like a uniform for as long as Teddy had known her had developed visible cracks. She said she knew she didn't have a legal claim. She said Drummond had convinced her to come, and she'd let him because she was scared and out of options and not thinking clearly. She said she was sorry. Not the reflexive sorry of someone trying to get something, but the slower, more uncomfortable kind that comes from actually sitting with what you've done. Teddy looked at her daughter-in-law for a long moment. She thought about the 14 days, the morning in the foyer, the sound of the deadbolt, the frost on the grass, and the pharmacy bench, and the bus ride to a town she'd never been to, and the root cellar door, and Gumbo scratching like his life depended on it. She thought about the first night on a cold stone floor, and the letter in Ignatius's handwriting, and the way she'd cried reading it in the pale afternoon light with a dog in her lap. She thought about what all of that had led to. I believe you, Teddy said finally, and I accept the apology. But I want you to hear something clearly. What you did to me was cruel. Not thoughtless, not merely insensitive. Cruel. You knew I had nowhere to go, and you opened the door anyway. I need you to know that I know that, and that I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make this moment more comfortable. Portia nodded. She looked like she might cry, which Teddy thought was probably good for her. The 4 women inside looked at her with the focused attention of people who had heard enough through a closed door to have opinions, but were too polite to say so immediately. Teddy poured herself a coffee and sat down. Well, she said, that's done. Eudora said she thought Teddy had handled it with more grace than the situation required. Lavinia said she would not have been so measured. Solange said nothing but refilled Teddy's cup without being asked, which was its own form of commentary. 6 months after Portia's visit, the property outside Sycamore Bend had become something Teddy still found slightly difficult to believe when she looked at it directly. The gatherings had grown. Fern had taken on more hours. A second fire pit had been added to accommodate the occasional Saturday, when 20 women showed up instead of 10. A local carpenter, a quiet man named August who'd heard about the place through his mother, had built a small open shelter near the garden, a roof structure with benches where people could sit out of the rain without going inside. It had become, without anyone planning it that way, the place where the most important conversations happened. A university extension program in Kellerton had reached out about a partnership, something involving workshops on financial literacy for older women. Teddy had said she'd think about it, which meant she was already thinking about it. A journalist from a regional paper had called twice about a longer feature piece. She'd agreed to one interview, on the condition that the story focused on the women who came to the gatherings rather than on her specifically. The journalist had agreed, and then written mostly about Teddy anyway, which she'd found both predictable and mildly irritating. She heard from Portia 8 months after the visit. A brief call, no preamble. Drummond was gone. The house had sold in a short sale. She was in a small apartment, working, paying her own way. She didn't ask for anything. She said she'd been thinking about what Teddy had said about Leander's name not being a tool and that it had stayed with her. She said she was trying to be a different kind of person than she'd been. Teddy said she was glad to hear it. She meant it. They spoke for 10 minutes and hung up. Teddy sat with the phone in her hand for a while after, thinking about Leander, about the kind of man he'd been, about whether he'd have found a way to hold all of this without bitterness. She thought he would have. He'd had his father's disposition that way. She went outside. The late afternoon light was doing what it did in October over open ground, turning everything amber and long-shadowed, and the garden was mostly finished for the season, but still held the remains of a good year. Gumbo was on the porch doing his surveillance routine, tracking something in the tree line with professional intensity. Teddy sat on the porch steps and looked at the root cellar door. Darnell had rehung it properly, fitted it with good hardware, made it something solid. But she kept it the way it had been found, functional and plain, because she liked what it represented. Ignatius had put something precious in that dark, cold place and trusted that it would keep. Trusted that she'd find it when she needed it. The fact that it took a small, stubborn dog and 15 years was beside the point. On her 74th birthday, the Saturday gathering was larger than usual. 31 women, ranging in age from 52 to 81, sat in the open air around the fire pit and the shelter August had built, drinking coffee and eating the pie Fern had made and talking with the easy warmth of people who had stopped pretending everything was fine and found, on the other side of that, something much better. Teddy stood up without a prepared speech and said what she actually thought. She said that 2 years ago she had walked out of a house that her own money had bought, carrying 2 bags and a dog, with nowhere to go and no clear reason to believe things would improve. She said that she had been wrong about the no reason part. She said that Ignatius had seen to that, quietly and practically and from beyond the grave, the way he'd done everything. She said that the women sitting in front of her had taught her more about resilience than anything she'd learned on her own, because resilience in company was a different thing than resilience alone. Alone, it was survival. Together, it was something you could actually build with. She said that if anyone had told her at 72, sitting on a pharmacy bench with $63 and a dog and a dead man's deed in her bag, that this was where she'd be at 74, she would not have believed them. But she would have wanted to. She sat back down. Gumbo climbed immediately into her lap. The fire crackled. Someone started passing the pie around again. The root cellar door caught the last of the afternoon light, solid on its new hinges, holding whatever was inside safe and sound. Teddy looked at it and felt, as she did most days now, that Ignatius was somewhere close by, watching the whole thing with that too big laugh and grease-stained hands and the quiet satisfaction of a practical man whose plan had worked out exactly right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.